Hello again, my name's Sean Kehoe, Chairman of UKIP in Erewash constituency, and I've been doing a series of talks on the UKIP manifesto, and one of the things in the manifesto is the whole problem of radical Islam, and UKIP is the only party which has the courage and the honesty to want to address those issues and to do anything about them. However, having said that, on this occasion I'm not seeking to talk about what UKIP is saying about these things. I want on this occasion to focus in on the recent dreadful events in Christchurch, New Zealand, with the gunman who has shot so many Muslims in a mosque, in two mosques in fact. So I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about it purely as myself. I'm not purporting to speak on behalf of UKIP. These are just my own personal thoughts, so I don't claim that I'm speaking for the party in this, but I want to set out how I feel and express some concerns I have which may not necessarily be obvious to everybody about what's been happening. But one of the things that's concerned me following this recent terrible event is the number of people who have been rushing to say that they condemn it. Now that might sound rather strange for me to say that, but what I'm saying is we didn't ought to need to say that we condemn it. Why are we feeling an obligation to say that we condemn this? Of course we condemn it. It ought to be taken for granted, it ought to be given, it ought to be taken as read that we condemn it. Indeed, our very system of law, the rule of law that we have, our common law prohibition of murder, our statutory prohibition of offences against the person of various types, make it illegal to carry out acts such as this, and these are long-standing positions that our law has adopted for a very long time. And why do we need, therefore, to say that we are against the killing of innocent Muslims in a mosque? Do you see the point? There is an implication that somehow we might be thought to be for it, and we've got to therefore say that we're not for it. Well, of course we're not for it. We are against it. All of us are against it. And when a man does the things that that man did, who shot those innocent people, then he was behaving appallingly. But these things go without saying. And there is a danger in falling over backwards to say these things. But in particular, there is this danger. I was hearing only a couple of days ago a man speaking on Radio 4 and saying that in his view, although ordinary people who speak against immigration or against the errors of Islam or against the jihadists and so forth, although those people themselves might not want to carry out acts of mass murder, their speech, their words might be taken by someone else as a basis, as a pretext, as a galvanizing cause for them to carry out an act of mass murder. Now, do you see the sinister implication in that? So what this man on the radio was suggesting was that we therefore ought to curtail our speech, because the very freedom of speech that we have, that we might seek to use to speak against Islam or to speak against Muhammad or to speak against the Quran or to speak against rape gangs or to speak against genital mutilation or to speak against jihadism and so on, beheadings and all these other things. The freedom that we might exercise to speak against those things ought to be curtailed, because it might prompt somebody else, somewhere else, to commit an outrageous act of violence. Now, I don't accept that logic. I think that the person who did what he did it for his own reasons, and it was nothing to do with me or you or President Trump or Tommy Robinson or anybody else. He did what he did because he did it. And we must not consent to the curtailing of our freedom of speech in order to accommodate that, I would say, spurious concern. In fact, I would say a dishonest concern, because I don't think it's honestly held. I think the person saying it knew that it wasn't valid, but he was seeking to use it as what you might call special pleading. It was just a bogus argument that conveniently supports the position he's seeking to advance. But there is also this. When someone wants to condemn so-called alleged far-right extremists, by which they don't just mean people who carry out acts of violence, by the way. They don't just mean that. They mean people who speak against Islam, against the Quran, against Muhammad, people who speak against the jihad, people who speak against immigration on an uncontrolled basis, and so forth. They think that's far right. But the people who say that that ought to be curtailed, have you noticed, they never think that the expression of pro-Islamic views, of jihadist views, they never think that those views should be curtailed. So you have this curious non-reciprocity, whereby it's assumed that the expression of so-called far-right views, let's just use their label for the moment, produces far-right, in inverted commas, actions, but they don't accept that the expression of jihadist views, the expression of Muhammad's views, the stating of what's in the Quran or the Hadith or the Seerah, the expression of those thoughts and views, they don't accept that those result in acts of jihad. So you have this idea, strange idea, that the people who are carrying out acts of jihad are not proper Muslims, and that the people who don't carry out acts of jihad, they are real Muslims. Well, how on earth can that be the case? The Quran, the Hadith, the Seerah, the life story of Muhammad, everything in the Islamic writings calls for jihad. It's not just once or twice, it's right the way through. Moreover, and this is a very important point, the later verses thereof, which abrogate earlier verses, and that's a clear principle of Islam, are the more violent verses, and therefore those are the ones which carry the greatest weight. Now, accordingly, I think it's right and proper to say this. It might sound provocative, but this, I think, is an unavoidable point. The people who carry out acts of jihad are actually the real Muslims, the real carriers out of the will and teachings of Muhammad. Now, thank God, most Muslims are not jihadists. Thank God most of them don't want to do that. But we mustn't therefore ascribe to them the label of genuine Muslims and put on the jihadists the label of false Muslims or misguided Muslims or Muslims who misunderstand Islam. That's not the case. The jihadists understand Islam absolutely correctly. The reason that the vast majority, thank God that the vast majority of Muslims don't obey Muhammad's teachings, is because they don't want to. They are essentially nominal Muslims, armchair Muslims. They don't want to do that. And I'm so grateful that they are. I'm not advocating that they should become jihadists. I'm speaking the opposite. I'm simply saying we need to call things by their proper names. And we need to be very careful when we are dealing with acts of violence such as this, that we do not use it or allow others to use it as a pretext for clamping down on free speech. Because I want to have my free speech and I want everybody else to have it. And I want everybody to be able to say what they want to say about immigration, about the Quran, about Islam, about anything else, about Buddhism, about Hinduism. I want everybody to be able to speak what they want to say freely. It is not incumbent upon the person who is speaking to act and speak in such a manner as not to provoke somebody else. It is incumbent upon the person hearing not to become inflamed, agitated or animated, or to become violent. That's the proper that's where the burden or the duty lies. and we need to keep it there. So it is not right or appropriate to seek to curtail our free speech on this misguided notion that by so doing we will therefore prevent acts of violence by so-called far-right people. I don't accept this appellation far-right. The label is misplaced, it's a wrong label. The people to whom it's attached are not far-right. Very few people who've used that term have, like I have done, carried out an intensive study of the 1920s, 30s and 40s, the rise of the Nazi Party. I've made a lifelong study of the life and times of Winston Churchill and World War II and the rise of the Nazis and how they were opposed and so forth. I know a lot about Nazism and the far right, as it were. And what we're speaking of, what people are speaking of when they oppose Islam is not being far right. It's an inaccurate, inappropriate label. Okay, well, I just want to make that point as a warning, and I think as a timely intervention in this understandable outpouring of emotion, because when there isn't an outpouring of emotion, sometimes logic and proper lucid legal thinking can go out of the window. Anyway, I thought I ought to interject in that way at this time, and I think and I hope it may be of benefit to some people. Thank you very much.